Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me is David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
And joining us today to talk a different conflict than the ones we have been focused on in between Israel and Gaza is Lily Lynch. Lily is a contributing writer now to the new Statesman, who I've been following for a while. And today we're going to talk about Ukraine and Russia. There has been this counteroffensive that has been ongoing for this year, Lily. I'm curious if you can give us the status of that to the best that we can judge it, as well as like kind of the expectations for what that was meant to bring.
Sure. Thank you guys for having me. Well, the counteroffensive was massively hyped earlier this year. It was going to supposedly really show the world like how Western military equipment and Ukraine was supposed to make incredible gains. So we kept hearing about this spring counteroffensive, and then it kind of months and months went on, and then it was summertime, and it sort of almost never quite arrived. And if it did, it hasn't accomplished much of anything. We're basically at the same place, or it's the stalemate, essentially, between Russia and Ukraine. No major ground has been recaptured. They're very, very tiny, maybe a field or two or a tiny little village, but effectively the same. And you can imagine how many human beings have lost their lives for that, and how much, say, U.S. support has gone into that, all for this rather bad result, very disappointing result. And there has been, I would say, by the end of the summer, there was a bit of an acknowledgement of this across the board in media, as well as U.S. officials kind of speaking frequently off the record to various media outlets and acknowledging the huge failure.
Yeah, I remember the Vilnius sort of NATO stuff. Was that a kind of around that turning point where it seemed like there was a vibe shift because I remember, I was in Madrid a week after Russia invaded Ukraine, and the solidarity with Ukraine was very palpable there. And I'm just curious, has there been like a significant vibe shift? Both locally in Ukraine, but also, with allies?
I think that's a really good point, that there was a vibe shift at the Vilnius NATO summit. For sure, there was a souring, or kind of I think there was an acknowledgement, a more kind of realistic assessment of where we're at, because Ukraine had really hoped to get a timeline for accession to NATO at that summit, and some of its closest allies, or some of its closest boosters, like Poland and the Baltic states, were really pushing for that. But the US and Germany were totally against it, so of course it was never a realistic idea. And so you had Zelensky really take to Twitter and kind of went on a rant. So you started to see these kind of fissures opening up. You saw, Zelensky openly kind of go having this outburst and being very angry with the West. But as for this other point and the vibe shift within Ukraine, I think, in the beginning, they were promised this tremendous amount of support, and obviously there was this so-called unprecedented Western unity we saw across Europe, and Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO. There was this real kind of sense of a cohesion in the West, but I think, and also within Ukraine, of a sort of sense of we're going to beat these guys back. And there's just been, over time, as you can imagine, just the general eroding of morale. I think we actually don't know how many, but tens of thousands of men fleeing conscription. And just a lot of the men who really wanted to fight, who were say patriotic and really eager, are dead or maimed, so it's I think it's gotten bleak. That's my unfortunate.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think in America in particular, there's a pretty serious misunderstanding about the morale situation in Ukraine. and also like what conscription and like that is in the country, and how certain groups of the population are reacting to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, like 2 days after the invasion, I think Zelensky imposed martial law, and all men between 18 and 60 years old were no longer allowed to leave Ukraine. And this, I mean, and anybody who spent a lot of time in Ukraine kind of knew, but it was kind of an open secret for a long time, for the first year of the war, I would say. But, tons of men were leaving, bribing border officials, getting doctor's notes for sort of, I don't know, for non-existent ailments. There are Ukrainian men of military age all over Europe. And in some cities like Odessa, where I spent a lot of time, there's just like an entire like almost small industry is like sprung up around avoiding conscription. So you have like Telegram channels, like 30,000 people, and they share information like where are the olives. And the olive is like the word they use to describe the men who come and get you and drag you to the military office, I think. And so they share information. Okay, they're in this square, avoid, and they're at this. So there's that. There are men who just like barricaded themselves inside their homes, and then of course there are men who've actually like died trying to. We just know for a fact as of June that just the Romanian border, so there are several other borders that Ukraine has, just the Romanian border, and by June, 90 men had died trying to either try to swim across the river or died freezing to death in the mountains. So, I mean, I'm sure that with winter coming, it's going to potentially get much worse. So, none of that paints a particularly good picture of what's going on inside Ukraine.
I just wanted to add that, like, I think, our audience I know is really smart, so they don't need to be told this twice, but a lot of people, I don't think have really reckoned with what this conflict is from the get-go, and particularly what it is now, that to maybe make any kind of shift means like sacrificing tremendous amounts of human life. I mean, it really means just pushing people to the front. And there's even a question about whether or not that would work in the first place. So to sit here sometimes in the US and talk about like, I don't know, like a flat conflict of, just a question of will and patriotism. I mean, this is people making decisions about their life, about whether or not they want to go and die for this, especially knowing that it might, it's feeling ever more unlikely that'll be successful in the first place. And I'm sorry, I just like, there's something really cynical about Americans sort of almost trying to push and pressure people to make these, the cliche, but the ultimate sacrifice here for whatever reason it is that the Americans have such a stake or interest in this conflict.
Absolutely. It's easy to kind of be a booster from the comfort of your home or in Western Europe too. And I think that it's obviously a very huge price to pay, and people realize there's essentially a stalemate. What are you dying for? Are you dying for this field or that field? It's very, very, very dark.
Right, because to me it's like maybe be nice to take that field, but it'd also be nice to have all those people who are dying for it, for whatever the peace looks like, to try to like build society up after that. And can you just outline some of the frustrations, like because we talk from this country, we see the sort of unified support rhetorically for Ukraine. We see the amount of money that's being spent. What are the frustrations from the Ukrainians of what we aren't providing before we get into our frustrations with the Ukrainians? Sure.
I think the Ukrainians feel that this is kind of links back to what Zelensky's outburst in Vilnius. There's been this sense of like, we've imbued these people with this sense of heroism and the kind of almost a myth making about the David versus Goliath situation, and they're made Zelensky into this kind of icon. And but at the same time, and we're using the language of like a 20th century world war to describe this. This is a conflict of like the West versus what are the barbaric East, and like a fight for democracy. So there's this sense that like rhetoric has been really, really lofty, and but the actions have not matched the rhetoric. There's a rhetoric policy gap when it comes to the U.S. relationship with Ukraine. So they've been frustrated about the furnishing of supplies and weapons. We've obviously been giving them a lot, but it's never enough. There have been disagreements about how to fight the war, where to concentrate soldiers. I think that the Ukrainians are very attached to parts of eastern Ukraine. The U.S. says don't worry about that, but there are disagreements, and there's a frustration that the U.S. doesn't understand sort of their style of fighting. The U.S. is kind of, this is part of your next question, but the U.S. has kind of put them down, saying they're Soviet. They have this Soviet style of fighting. Of course, we can ascribe everything bad to that. But yeah. So there is a sense of sort of frustration, you got our hopes up, and then what's going on? What are you actually doing? So the actions we've taken are much more kind of tentative than the rhetoric. And I think the Ukrainians know that, yeah.
I mean, I hate to say it, but I don't know where they would have got the idea that we have a good track record in winning wars. With regards to and there's one report I saw this summer, which was the first time where it was kind of, and I never know how to judge these things about what morale is, people talking about the IDF, what is the IDF's morale? It's I hear some things, I hear others. It's hard to know, but I do know that, when people say, with Crimea, it's an easy one. I am willing to say, let's not try to keep this conflict alive to retake that. I'm willing to, and then people say, well, it's easy for you to give away people's land. And to me, it's not easy. I feel less secure making that position about places Russia has controlled since this invasion. But I also want to say, how many people are going to die that aren't going to be here for the peace? Because again, I mentioned Spain, but I was listening to Spanish Civil War audiobooks while I was there, and that war went on a long time, and a lot of people died, and it still failed. And so I'm just curious, and maybe I'm kind of skipping ahead again, but as far as a resolution comes to this, before we get to that, talk about the frustrations from the U.S. side about Ukraine fighting this conflict.
Okay, there have been a lot of these frustrations have been voiced through kind of anonymous, off-the-record sources in Washington to various media outlets. The overall kind of feeling is that that we furnished them with this. We built up this enormous amount of weaponry, and we can't do that again. That was one comment from an anonymous Pentagon official. Also, disagreements about where to concentrate troops. I think the U.S. has wanted Ukraine to focus on the south, and then the Ukrainians wanted to focus on the east. I know that there has been increasing kind of frustration with Zelensky and some of his style of diplomacy, and some sense that the word ungrateful has been used, and it was used by the British first in Vilnius, but I think that's a sentiment that other people are feeling in the U.S. That's maybe being discussed, not maybe at the official level, but it's in public. So there is a kind of you see this shift from the beginning of the conflict where there's almost like hero worship going on with respect to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. And now there's this real sense of just kind of deflated, like a more realistic picture. And I don't know where that leaves Ukraine. Yeah.
Right. And so Lula recently said that neither Zelensky or Putin are interested in ending this. He said that in August. Is that basically still the case? Is there any sort of pointing toward a resolution with the allies getting a little bit less patient?
I don't think so. I think that Lula is spot on. I think that this war is primal for both Russia and Ukraine, and for all the complaining and sort of venting of frustration that the U.S. has engaged in, there's no way that even we're going to back down anytime soon with it. We're too deep in. We've put too much into it, and I have no idea what kind of end is in sight, because I don't see The Ukrainians feel very much this is a war, a genocidal war. This is the language they're using. So the idea that they would sit at a negotiating table with Putin at this point just seems very unrealistic to me.
Yeah. And is there anything on the Russian side that, like, any developments that people should be aware of from, like, I mean, maybe as this counteroffensive has gone on?
I haven't really heard anything. I think that they're also, for them, it's also basically the primal war to the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my concern, is that this, because, again, I mean, maybe I need more frames of reference than the Spanish Civil War, but, like, as a testing ground for these different empires to, kill people. And they feel sort of comfortable with that as like a no man's land. And, like with all these casualties, I just think, like, people should read your piece. The realists were right in the New Statesman, because that is my concern, is that we can't be telling America can't be telling Ukrainians, like, actually you need to go push through these, this line of tanks or something like that. Like that I'm not comfortable with that. I'm much more likely to give away, like, I'm just curious, like, these places that Russia has control of, let's say there was a sort of a move to peace and we're going to parcel up some of that land. Do you have any idea of where their loyalties would lie? How, like, has this war, like, turned them against Russia more than they maybe had been before? Like, I'm just curious about that question. That's
a really good question. A really, really good question. So certainly, as you guys probably know, like, Eastern Ukraine, the war has been going on there since 2014, and I actually haven't checked the polling. I don't know if there is any accurate polling recently, but that region historically has tended to be, pro-Russia and sympathetic to Russia, and so that's another piece. But why are we fighting for these parts of Ukraine if we believe in the concept of self-determination elsewhere in the world? Like, why? And also, that's the case of Crimea as well. So yeah, that's a really important question, and I think that elsewhere in Ukraine, from what I know, I other regions that tended to kind of be kind of not Western Ukraine, which has kind of overwhelmingly been very pro-West, pro-EU, pro-NATO, but parts of the country like Odessa, which is a Russian-speaking city and kind of cosmopolitan, and kind of has always been a little bit independent from the rest of the country. Right before the war, I think that the overwhelming majority of people wanted neutrality. They really supported, like, a neutral position, which I think made sense for that particular region of Ukraine. And from what I understand, though, this war, has really, like, increased Ukrainian nationalism and patriotism, say, because there's this, external threat. And so I know that in Odessa the numbers have changed, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but now you see a much larger percentage of people who are, say, pro-Ukrainian or pro-Kiev or pro-NATO US. So I would say that, yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that, like, Russia kind of managed to consolidate support in some places where it was already popular, and then also, but, like, alienated a lot of people elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, and, it'd be nice to be able to work through some of these things with a political process instead of, seeing who can kill more on each side. David, were you going to say something?
Well, no, I was just wanting to maybe talk a little bit about NATO, because when you ask yourself the question of, like, what has this conflict done? Who's winning? And I'm not even talking about the direct conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, NATO has had a pretty tremendous makeover, even in, certainly in America, where it was not necessarily questioned too much, but at least in some portions of the left, there was questioning of it. That's become sort of untenable. And then also other parts of Europe, which usually, tend to pride themselves on at least being more neutral. I mean, this kind of Atlanticism has really got firm ground, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it was like, that's one point that I think a lot of people made. Putin revived NATO. Even after the annexation of Crimea, enlargement was revived. You had two countries here in the Balkans, that Macedonia and Montenegro joined. And then after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Finland and Sweden, two countries with very long-standing neutrality policies, Sweden's going back 200 years, they decided that this is the moment that we need to join NATO. That this is a much more, they felt the need to kind of demonstrate some sort of solidarity that way. I don't think that Sweden or Finland were under threat by Russia. But yeah, it really the war revived this Atlanticism, and the one thing that's important to know about that is that I think that Finland and Sweden in particular, when they joined, this was when they applied to join. Sorry, there's been some hurdles put up by Erdogan for Sweden, but the decision to join was kind of taken during this this kind of immediately after the war, when everybody was very afraid. So it was criticized as sort of a shock doctrine kind of approach to NATO enlargement. So, yeah.
Well, I would be curious, from where you're sitting. I mean, I'm trying not to be too much of an American here and focus on the States. I do want to talk about the U.S. in just a second. But in Europe, I'm curious, because I mean, one thing that I think is notable about this conflict, and it's notable about most conflicts today, or for the past half century now, is the media wars around it. And you've had a lot of people go really gung ho. Obviously, I'm more familiar with the Anglo media. You have people like Paul Mason and all these figures in the UK going really hard on this. And, as you note in your piece, I mean, a big portion, for example, of this counteroffensive was these high expectations that were set by a lot of media, people in the media, and also people who are interviewed regularly on the TV. I'm curious to hear where you sort of are seeing things stand in Europe more broadly, but, with special attention, I guess, to the UK and more the Anglosphere.
You mean how the media has changed, or how it's covering it currently?
How you're seeing the media has been changing, as we're seeing that these promises that were made did not materialize.
Well, I think that you did see the media coverage take on this very kind of grim tone, I would say midsummer, and that's kind of more or less continued. You've had occasional, you have people who are kind of true believers who are saying that Ukraine has made some gains in the Black Sea, but this is kind of a goalpost shifting to me, because the counteroffensive didn't really materialize. It didn't really gain the country any much territory back. So now they're saying, oh, well, look at they did this in the Black Sea. But generally speaking, the media coverage has been much more realistic and much more negative. It kind of, the early days of the conflict, when I remember there were these stories about Ukrainian grandmothers with jars of pickles who were downing drones or whatever, and it was very, very, a lot of early myth making. That's really given way to a much more kind of realistic picture, and I don't know, how much is going to change now that there's another war in the Middle East that's kind of overshadowing Ukraine. And I think that there's now more questions about, should we even don't forget about Ukraine. Ukraine still needs to be won. Don't let all of your attention shift, because we all have short attention spans and can only focus on what's happening.
This is a little anecdotal, but I'm here in Texas, where I'm from, and we love our Texas flag, right? And at the beginning of the conflict, a guy in my neighborhood has a little flagpole, and he took down his Texas flag, and he put up another Texas flag, but instead of the red and the blue, it was the blue and the yellow. So it was a Texas flag, but in the Ukraine colors. And I walked by it his house the other day, and the Ukraine Texas flag is down and now flying very proudly as a University of Texas Longhorns flag, which I don't know. I mean, it's anecdotal, obviously, but it really does show a mentality that we sort of experience.
It's a great anecdote. No, totally. I mean, you see this on Twitter too. People who had Ukrainian flag emojis now. I some kind of people who are specialists, academics who study the region. They're I see Ukrainian flag is being taken out of people's bios or out other people's handles. So yeah, but it's interesting to hear that it's actually happening in the physical space too. I was back home in Berkeley like last year and this year, and there were Ukrainian flags everywhere. I did not expect that at all. So it was quite interesting to see. But I'm guessing that a lot of those people are going to be putting some new flags up, or if they haven't already.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I feel like a lot of sorry for people stuck in this invasion, because like it's not the attention is going to be moved as much as our credibility has been completely shot by what we're doing in Gaza. Like the words, when we say words like democracy or genocide, like, and we want them to be taken seriously. And while we're snowing this, like, it just seems catastrophic for any, because the only way I ever saw out of this was America would be able to get the sort of non-aligned countries and some of the other countries that we're typically opposed to come and say, you know what, this sort of incursion isn't something we want in the 21st century. And we haven't been able to build that. And I feel like this, like, as far as like us being able to impose, like, it just seems like this Gaza stuff is just the end to any dreams we'd be able to do that.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I had the same thought in the first couple of days of this war in Gaza. I was thinking, this, like the efforts that were made for the past, say, 2 years by Western leaders to kind of promote the Ukrainian cause in the countries of the so-called global South, like in the non-aligned countries, that's over. That is absolutely over. Non-aligned countries obviously have a very strong affinity with Palestine, and they're not going to believe. I mean, the sense that already existed before this was already one of like deep distrust and resentment, and now it's over. I totally agree. All of these words are totally hollow. The entire world can see that, and I'm actually really glad that people back home in the U.S. are also seeing that now. Of course, this is something like in the Balkans, the cynicism has existed for a long time. But so I'm really happy to hear you say those things, like democracy and genocide. Those words are like, yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, like, you go ahead, David.
Oh, no. I was just going to ask another question here because, I mean, I'm curious, we talked a little bit about like the big media. But I think one thing that's been sort of shocking, both in the US and the UK, as far as I've been able to follow it, has been the reaction from some people on the left. Now, there are certain characters who sort of paint themselves as left, and they just sort of, they'll fly whatever way the wind's blowing. But it was a little shocking to me to see how hardline a lot of, like, let's call them like American, like progressive socialist leaning people who got really brought into the Bernie Sanders thing, but maybe didn't have like deep roots. We like, for example, like Michael Brooks, our good friend, did a lot of work in this country, teaching people about Lula, for example. And you would have people using Lula as this symbol of a different model of politics. He had a lot of support. And then when Lula would say something like, hey, we should do peace, we're like, well, Lula's actually, crazy now, and we don't trust him. And, even if you don't agree with what Lula's position is, I agree with him. But it's a very normal position, in fact, to say, hey, what we need to be doing is pursuing peace and end to this slaughter. And the American discourse at large, really cut this out. But I was really shocked and, to be quite honest, like frightened to see how quickly it hardened even amongst like the left, if we would call it that.
Absolutely. Me too. I think that there was this, I think for some people it seemed like, okay, a smaller, like less powerful country is being invaded by, a much more powerful country. So we need to stick with, the people who are in a more vulnerable position. I can understand that in a certain way, but the idea, and I can understand. I don't support Russia. I support Ukraine in this conflict, even though I have major qualms with how the war has happened and the political situation in Ukraine. But the fact that there is this sense of like NATO and the U.S. have to go for Ukraine's maximalist aims. We need to look the other way when we see neo-Nazi groups. We need to give them we have to like totally embrace the U.S. like defense industry and like military industrial complex. It really is a pretty ugly decision, and it pretty like it's kind of erodes a lot of like values that I think they're really important for the left to have, and it has been disappointing. And not only the fact that they believe these things, but they're willing to kind of bully other people and kind of try to really attack people. I mean, the discourse around the war in Ukraine, at least online, it's despicable. Like what happens if you kind of step even a tiny bit out of line. Even if you say you support Ukraine, if you say the word peace, it's like peace has become synonymous with genocide in that conflict. If you say, I say that a lot. I mean, it's unreal.
Yeah, and the sort of like, if you look at any sort of history prior to like a certain day that the conflict started, it means you are justifying like an invasion. It's just like, that's not, that's not how like people that actually write research on this topic deal with like the topic of like what was the role of NATO expansion or even NATO centrality in the defense of Europe. Like these are actual questions that people are addressing. And there's this entire thing as if it's just Putin apologists online, which of course there are those,
Sure.
but we need to be able to have these conversations.
Yeah, it's a really pathetic discourse. But I mean, the one thing that's kind of been tiny positive is like the people who have been reasonable and intelligent about it. I just feel like very thankful for them. And they do exist in our circles. They do exist. So have been able to talk to you guys about this, for example.
Well, I was going to say, one of those people is Lily Lynch. Lily, you can follow her at Lily S. Lynch on Twitter. Check her stuff out in the New Statesman. It's exciting to see you there, Lily. Thank you so much for staying up with us tonight.
Thank you guys so much. It was really nice talking to you.